The AMD RX 5700 XT is flooding the used market in 2023. AliExpress and eBay are full of examples, both from names you know and names pulled straight from a name generator, and this competition is driving prices down. Perhaps it's because of its pedigree as a mining card, or a general mistrust of AMD among gamers, but this sub-£200 second-hand bargain has only 0.62% of the gaming market share according to Valve. That, in my opinion, is an absolute travesty. It's rare that AMD fields a full team these days. The RX 6000 series might have run the gamut from entry-level to ultra-premium, but the 5000 series was capped out at both ends. The best RDNA 1-based consumer graphics card was the RX 5700 XT, at least 2 levels below what AMD would normally call their top tier. Like the rest of the RDNA 1 line, this card's ubiquity on AliExpress and eBay has come about thanks to the end of Ethereum mining, which does mean there's a chance you'll pick up a card that's already been well used. If you can pick one up from a reputable source with a warranty and a returns policy, however, this could be an enticing prospect for playing the latest titles. The model I picked up on AliExpress for this video is a Sapphire Pulse Edition, one of the better reviewed low-cost models at launch, and was in very good condition, better than the 5600 XT I reviewed recently, which had a bad fan and some rusty screws. My test platform is the moderately priced gaming PC, chosen to represent what I think is a good value mid-range PC in 2023, with a Ryzen 5 5600X and a B550 motherboard to give access to the full Gen 4 PCI Express that this card supports. The 32GB of RAM may be a little overkill for this price point, but DDR4 is very reasonable these days, and besides that, it also means I have at least 2 ranks per channel. Also, for those who are interested, resizable bar is enabled. Starting with simultaneously the second newest release and oldest title on the roster, Resident Evil 4 Remake. While there are plenty of settings to play with, I've started with the quality presets, and then dropped texture resolution to fit. This game, like many other RE Engine titles, can be a bit of a VRAM monster. At 1080 max settings, I had to drop texture resolution to 2GB, though the 5700 XT obtained a little short of 90 FPS. Heartened by this, I bumped up the resolution to 1440 and dropped the preset to graphics priority, from where I found I could actually increase textures to 3GB without issue. Frames were pretty close too, only dropping to 86 FPS, meaning the adventurous could probably increase things even further. I had one quick blast at 4K, using the same settings as for 1440, and saw just shy of 50 FPS on average. Reducing just a couple more settings could actually see a perfectly playable 4K experience here. A game which doesn't allow you to fully disable resolution scaling is trying to tell you something about its performance. A Plague Tale Requiem is an extremely demanding game, and the 5700 XT is only partly up to the challenge. At 1080 high with maxed out scaling, the game can average close to 70 FPS, but lows dip as far as 50, and more demanding scenes in the game could see more regular drops below 60 FPS. 1440 can only be relied upon for a 50 FPS average, and this is by dropping to medium. Though of course a more aggressive FSR setting could help if you're looking for a little extra performance at the cost of some fidelity. 4K is unfortunately something of a lost cause, only averaging 30 FPS at the low preset. As always, Forza Horizon 5 can be trusted to deliver great performance on modern GPUs, and the 5700 XT is no different. At 1080 it's possible to stretch up to Ultra, the highest non-ray-traced preset available, and still crack 100 FPS on average in the benchmark. While 1440 could potentially run at Ultra, the game would most likely eat up the 8GB of available VRAM, hence why I dropped to high and saw over 120 FPS. If you are hoping to plug into a 4K TV, the 5700 XT has you covered there too, with 2160 high delivering almost 80 FPS, with 1% lows close to 70. Another notoriously demanding game, Halo Infinite looks pretty good at 1080 high and gives a pretty smooth 84 FPS on average in outdoor scenes. Indoors and smaller scale multiplayer matches will see higher frames, but this is about the worst case scenario and should be close to what you'd expect to see in big team multiplayer battles. 1440 remains above 60 FPS on average, but dips well below that, so for competitive play you'd probably be best dropping quality to medium. I'd advise against using this card at 4K in Halo, at least without upscaling. Even at low settings it fails to hit a 60 FPS average. Once more, the newest release I'm covering is somehow also a decade old. The Last of Us Remake has been out a few days now and is already establishing a reputation as being rough on lower end hardware. The RX 5700 XT was listed as the recommended GPU for 1080 60 FPS at high settings, and I can confirm this is pretty accurate. The actual high preset does exceed the VRAM requirements of an 8GB card, according to the in-game indicator, but MSI Afterburner seemed to suggest otherwise, with VRAM usage hovering around the 7GB mark. Nevertheless, I played a few hours of the game in a slightly customised version of high, with environmental textures dropped to medium. The game still looks pretty great at these settings, and aside from the occasional spike when loading new data, there wasn't much negative to report. Aside from waiting the better part of an hour for shaders to compile, including a crash in the middle. I've settled on a short benchmark run in the second chapter of the game, in a wooded area just outside of the city. This is a little more intensive than some of the earlier areas, which could frequently jump into the 80s. The benchmark run, however, only occasionally rises above 60 FPS, averaging 68.7. Using the high preset only shaves about a frame off, at 67.4, though there is always the possibility that at some point the card will run out of VRAM. At 1440 it's possible to play at a customised version of medium with environmental textures dropped to low and still be within the VRAM limit as indicated by the game. Whether you want to risk running at full medium is up to you. I suspect you might get away with it without too many issues, and details will certainly look a lot more impressive. FPS does drop below 60 but not far below 50, with an average of 55 and 1% lows of 42. At 4K, low settings is well within the VRAM limits, but performance is dramatically compromised, averaging in the 40s and dropping to the high 20s at times. Low settings also does a number on textures and LODs, so you might want to try medium and run some FSR to get a more aesthetically pleasing 4K-ish 30 FPS experience. Although ray tracing isn't an option for the 5700 XT, Spider-Man Remastered can still perform wonders on this card. At otherwise maxed out settings, 1080 sees an average of over 100 FPS, with the really significant sub 60 FPS drops only really occurring when the whole city's in view. 1440 is hardly any trouble either, with averages of 80 and those panoramic views causing drops only as far as about 50 FPS. 4K needs dropping to medium in order to get a 60 FPS average, but this doesn't stop the occasional wild frame time spike causing 1% lows in the teens. 4K display owners might want to consider using some upscaling with this one. Sony's run continues in Uncharted, which, while being an older title, was only ported to PC late last year. I have to say I'm a little disappointed though. Shadow resolution in-game is lacking even at Ultra, making close-ups look a bit ugly at times. Still, frame rates are superb. At 1080, the 5700 XT once more sees averages pass 100 FPS, with healthy 90 plus 1% without sacrificing quality. Pushing up to 1440 is still perfectly possible at Ultra too, averaging 70 and with lows of about 60. Those with an abundance of caution could potentially do some tweaking, but I think this is still a top-notch experience. 4K naturally requires some compromise, as at Ultra the average dips below 40 and 1% hover above 30. You could maybe aim for a 30 FPS lock, but I think this would be a good occasion for some FSR. God of War's numbers don't trend too far away from the other Sony titles, except for The Last of Us, naturally. Like with that game, however, the 8GB frame buffer is potentially limiting if you are thinking of trying out the highest settings, but in my opinion the game still looks great at high. At 1080, again, averages break past 100. 1440 is superb at 75 FPS, with lows still well above 60. And once more, I think that 4K would benefit from using some FSR upscaling, as without it, frames drop to 46 on average. At some point in the recent past, I think CDPR has been messing with Cyberpunk's quality presets again. 1080 high could be run at 60 FPS on a Vega 56 last summer. This year, the generally far more potent RX 5700 XT can only beat that by 10%, though of course this is still perfectly playable. Without touching the resolution scaler, 1440 can maintain a 50 plus average by dropping to the medium preset, which still looks fantastic, but you might want to kick in a little FSR to keep things running smoothly. 4K is pretty much out of the question without FSR, as at medium it fails to maintain 30 FPS. Whether it's due to a recent patch or just some really good optimization for RDNA, The Witcher 3 Remastered runs really well here. Although the hardware RT features are naturally greyed out and impossible to adjust, I was able to use the ultra quality preset at both 1080 and 1440 resolution. This slow ride through Novigrad doesn't take it easy on GPUs or CPUs, but the 5700 XT manages almost 90 FPS at 1080 and 75 FPS at 1440. At 4K it's still capable of good results, though I did drop quality to medium as my experience at the start of the run suggested it might get close to 60 FPS. However, by the end of the run that had dropped all the way down to 50 on average, with 1% lows of 43. I picked Overwatch 2 for my benchmark suite this year as something for the low-spec GPUs, so it can look a little out of place when tested using an 8GB upper mid-range model like the 5700 XT. Although I tested at epic settings to make sure there was something worth testing, there's plenty of room to increase frames further by dropping quality. At 1080 epic we're just shy of the 144 FPS mark, with a 135 average and 1% lows over 100. 1440 doesn't dip too far, averaging a shade under 100 FPS with minimums of 76. 4K, however, is a bit too much to ask at epic, only averaging 54 FPS and dropping into the low 40s. You'll probably want to drop to high or even medium before trying to play as 4K. As I've mentioned before, I have 3 quality settings for testing Fortnite on a given graphics card, all in DX12. One is the lowest quality preset, with view distance bumped up to epic and resolution scaling at 100%, the so-called competitive settings. One is at medium, again with 100% resolution scaling, and the last is using the epic preset. At 1080 competitive, the RX 5700 XT runs Fortnite impeccably well, averaging over 300 FPS. If you prefer a little more visual fidelity, you can safely turn up to medium without dropping far below 200 FPS on average. Increasing quality to epic involves some of the UE5 ray tracing shenanigans, and without RT hardware to accelerate matters, the 5700 XT struggles, only able to push just over 40 FPS on average and dropping into the low 30s. 1440 naturally takes something of a hit, but for the most part you don't need to use any resolution scaling to keep things running smoothly. At competitive settings there's a 222 FPS average, almost good enough to max out a 240Hz panel. The medium option is close enough to be attractive for a 144Hz monitor like mine. The epic preset though is a step too far. Averages hit 30 and lows are in the 20s. You could maybe have a good time in creative mode or just hanging out, but you won't have a fun time shooting people at this frame rate. Finally, I skipped epic at 4K because I think we all know how that will go. At competitive settings, the 5700 XT can still deliver the goods at almost 120 FPS, and raised to medium it can still remain about the 60 FPS mark. All in all, for competitive play, you really couldn't ask for a much better GPU in Fortnite. And while the numbers aren't quite as impressive for Warzone, there's still good news across the board. 1080 and 1440 can actually run the game at Ultra, though again without ray tracing. and without having to resort to any kind of scaling. At 1080, frames break past 110 on average, with lows of about 75. Adding the newly introduced FSR 2.1 or XeSS could help bring those minimums up a bit, but as I'm not really a proponent of using upscaling in battle royales, I'd recommend you drop the quality preset instead. At 1440, averages approach 80 FPS, with lows dipping ever so slightly below 60. Again, dropping quality to balanced might be advisable over using upscaling. That being said, I find target acquisitions a little easier at higher resolutions, so maybe it's not quite out of the question to add a little FSR. Finally, at 4K, there's not enough headroom for ultra or even balanced, but dropping to basic might not give the best quality shadows and textures, but it can still give a 60 FPS average, so although it's not a perfect choice for 4K, you could definitely make it work. The RX 5700 XT might not have been the flagship GeForce killer AMD fans were craving in 2019, but it was a solid competitor in the upper mid-range space back then, and given that the mid-range market hasn't moved on all that far in terms of overall rendering performance, if you can live without hardware RT, it can still perform even today. Even better, at the kind of prices being asked on AliExpress, there's not a whole lot else out there that can compete. The closest that comes to mind are the RTX 2070 Super, which still costs up to 50% more, but can at least do hardware RT, or the RX 6600M, which seems to be the rare instance of a mobile GPU reverse engineered to run on desktop without also being a scam. The RX 5700 XT has the distinction of being the second fastest Radeon I've ever tested. The fastest was the RX 6900 XT, which, despite costing 3 times as much, is still a good deal, and you can hear my explanation why in the video linked on screen now. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.